Okay, I won't apologize for not doing a PowerPoint. I'm doing a paperpoint. But even doing a paperpoint, I have problems because I printed out the wrong version, small font, but I think I can read it, which will be fine. Anyway, the title, as I say, is Judicial Bias, Meaning, and the Law. So what's wrong with these statements? The Second Amendment says the government can't infringe on the rights of people to bear arms. The law declared at one time that slaves were property and blacks were non-citizens. Laws against drugs cry out their meanings in ways easily understood. The answer is, laws don't talk. They are words on paper or screens, inanimate and incapable of producing sounds. Judges produce sounds and written opinions, and the sounds and written opinions they produce in rendering decisions determine what the law is. Judges are like ventriloquists, speaking for the law, which can be thought of as a puppet having its strings pulled. The meaning of laws are not in laws themselves. Their meanings are in decisions of judges, or as practitioners of general semantics might put it, meaning is in people, not in things. That meanings are in people was clear to me as a first-year law student in 1968. And the idea led me to think that while studying the law was all well and good, there ought to be a law school course devoted to studying the judges making rulings on the law to see if there were personal biases that sway them in their rulings. It seemed to me that judges, like every other person I had met in my life, were susceptible, knowingly or unknowingly, to bringing their prejudices and predispositions to the work that they did. There were countless illustrations of how personal biases of judges affect their decisions in cases. In 1857, in a shameful case that stunned the nation, this is the Dred Scott case, many of you who are from the United States know about that case, Dred Scott versus Sanford, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, ruled in a 7-2 decision that slaves were property and that blacks and freedmen were not citizens. Through these decisions, black people, wherever they lived, were reduced to the status of commodities. The Taney Court was dominated by pro-slavery judges from the South. Of the 9 judges on the court, 7 had been appointed by pro-slavery presidents, and 5 had come from slave-holding families. Chief Justice Taney had characterized the abolitionist movement as one of northern aggression. 2 justices raised in the North dissented in the Scott case. Justice John McLean of Ohio concluded that nothing in the Constitution required, this is even worse because this is not only a small font, but pale font, required someone from the United States to do anything more to become a citizen. Benjamin Curtis of Massachusetts wrote that the argument that Scott was not a citizen was more a matter of taste than of law, saying black men were not only considered citizens, but could vote in 5 of the 13 states at that time. Their arguments fell on deaf ears. The decision in the Scott case was a triumph for the slaveocracy and showed the power the South had over the higher court in the land. So clearly we know, certainly in the United States, we know that elections have consequences, and presidential elections have consequences in terms of judges who are appointed to the Supreme Court. Anyway, in 1896, the Supreme Court declared in Plessy v. Ferguson that racial segregation laws did not violate the Constitution if the facilities for each state were equal in quality, a policy that became to be known as separate but equal. It was a 7-1 decision that legitimized the many state laws that had reestablished racial segregation in the South after the end of Reconstruction and opened the floodgate for Jim Crow legislation. The one dissenting justice in the case, John Marshall Harlan, took umbrage with the majority and saying they were being willfully ignorant of the purpose of the Louisiana law, which was the Plessy law against Plessy, that they were ruling on. That law required equal but separate accommodation by race in railway cars. He argued that everybody knew the purpose of the Louisiana law was not to exclude whites from railway cars occupied by blacks, but the other way around. He said the Constitution was colorblind, and with respect to civil rights, all citizens had equal rights before the law. Most legal scholars believe the 7 Supreme Court justices who ruled the Louisiana law constitutional knew, like everybody else there in the country actually, the purposes of that law, and like many in the country, believed whites were socially superior to blacks. With the end of Reconstruction, the country had stopped paying much attention to the conditions of the South with respect to race relations, so they could get away with that ruling. These considerations were likely in the minds of the justices who voted to oppose racial segregation in the Plessy case, which stood until 1954 when it was overruled in Brown versus Board of Education. Bush v. Gore, 2000, you're of a certain age, you remember that, and I suspect people in this room are of that age, was a Supreme Court case in which, for the first time in American history, the court decided who would be the next president of the United States. In proceedings lasting just 2 days, the court determined that it was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause to count uncounted votes in Florida without clear uniform standards. Now, that was a 5-4 ruling, and in that ruling, the 5 justices who ruled for it were Republican-appointed justices. The 4 that ruled against it were not. And so lots of Americans thought the verdict smacked of political favoritism, in that a good number of the Republican lawyers representing Bush, who had a few hundred more votes than Gore in that election, at least at that time, had clerked for the court's Republican justices and had worked for far right-wing special interest groups that had put pressure on loyalists, like Justice Clarence Thomas, to influence the court's conservatives. Prior to the case, these conservatives had consistently argued for federalism and states' rights, a judicial philosophy that, if applied, would have resulted in remanding the case to the Florida courts. The dissenting justices referenced that last point in their published opinion, citing the hasty about-face that the conservative justices made in reinstating a position they had previously simply opposed. The judgment of the court stopped the counting, with George Bush in the lead by just a few hundred votes. Many people felt if Gore rather than Bush had been in the lead, the court would have allowed the vote to go on. Justice Paul Stevens, in his dissent, concluded that the nation would never know for sure who had won the 2000 presidential election, but the loser was clear. It was the nation's confidence in judges as impartial arbiters of the rule of law. With respect to judges being impartial, determiners of the law, the 2017 article in the Florida Law Review titled Judging Implicit Bias, a National Empirical Study of Judicial Stereotypes, described an empirical study that tested this notion. The study looked at 239 sitting federal and state judges, including 100 federal district judges representing all the circuits, and examined the ways in which judicial implicit bias may manifest in court cases. The findings showed that judges harbored strong to moderate negative implicit stereotypes against Asian Americans and Jews, which, while holding favorable implicit stereotypes towards whites and Christians. These negative stereotypes associated Asians and Jews with immoral traits such as, in quotes, greedy, dishonest, and controlling, and associated whites and Christians with moral traits such as trustworthy, honest, and giving. The study also found that federal district court judges sentenced Jewish defendants to marginally longer prison terms than identical Christian defendants, and that implicit bias was likely the cause in the disparity. The authors said their study suggested that automatic biases and cognitions influenced a much broader range of judicial decisions than had previously been considered. In 2022, the Supreme Court in Dobbs v. Jackson, of course we all know that decision who live here, uh, said the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. The court's decision overruled both Roe v. Wade 1974 and Planned Parenthood v. Casey 1992, returning to individual states the power to regulate any aspect of abortion not protected by federal law. Linda Greenhouse, a journalist who covers the Supreme Court and the law for the New York Times, argued that religious doctrine and not the law drove the Dobbs decision, whose renunciation of Roe was affirmed by 5 justices raised in the Catholic Church. There was only one Catholic justice in the court that decided on Roe. Greenhouse noted that in the 79-page majority decision, there are a good deal of highly partial and substantially irrelevant accounts of the history of abortion's criminalization and very little actual law. Critics of Dobbs have said the court's decision privileges religious over non-religion, which is in itself unconstitutional, and privileges the life of the fetus over the life of the mother. They claim it's a case in which religious morality prevailed over secular law. Roe was doomed when 3 Catholic anti-abortion leaning justices were appointed by the Supreme Court during the presidency of Donald Trump. As a candidate, Trump had pledged to end Roe through the appointment of Supreme Court justices. Trump chose the 3 justices from a list of candidates supplied by the Federalist Society, a group committed to overturning Roe. The Dobbs decision is a textbook case of how religious biases of judges can impact the law. Another case involving religion influencing judicial decision-making is Burdock v. Center of Reproductive Medicine, 2023, an Alabama Supreme Court case that in an 8-1 decision elevated human embryos to the status of children for the purpose of wrongful death lawsuits. In his special concurrence, Chief Justice Tom Parker argued that human life cannot be wrongfully destroyed without incurring the wrath of a holy God who views the destruction of his image as an affront to himself. Parker said that even before birth, all human beings have the image of God, and their lives cannot be destroyed without effacing his glory. The word God appears 41 times in Parker's opinion, along with quotes from the Bible and Christian theologians such as St. Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin. Parker's comments on the Burdock case are an example of a government official backing Christian nationalism, a movement that seeks to privilege Christianity and merge Christian and American identity. Since first elected to the 9-member court in 2004, and in his legal career before that, Parker had been transparent in voicing how his Christian beliefs have significantly formed his understanding of the law and approach, both as a lawyer and as a judge. Whatever one may think of Parker's vote in this case, and to his credit, Parker wears his religious biases on his black robe sleeve, such transparency among judges is rare, which is why in 1968, I argued the merits of having a class in law school devoted to studying judicial bias and legal decisions. It never happened, but for the record, I still think it's a good idea. Thank you.